Hello and welcome to Central Coast Newspapers Video News. My name is Jackie Pearson and today I'm joined by Father Rod Bauer. Father Rod is actually the Archdeacon for Justice in the Diocese of Newcastle. Welcome, Father Rod.
Thank you for having me.
I'm sure you're well known by all of our readers and viewers. Thank you very much for your time. You've just written your second book, I believe.
I have indeed.
And it's called Outspoken.
Strangely enough.
How did you ever come across that title?
The publisher was actually putting pressure on me for a working title, and I couldn't think of anything. So he said, "Oh, just call it Outspoken because all justice is social," and then it became the working title, and then they liked it at the end of the day, and it stuck.
All justice is
It's
social. And I've heard a couple of and read a couple of the interviews that you've done since the release of the book, and you very much talk in the book or explore in the book that continuum, that balance between what you call justice and order.
Yeah.
Do you want to give us a definition of what you mean by that?
Well, often we need order, really important. We don't want anarchy, so order is really important, but order without justice is tyranny. And often we see that in social dynamics, everything from personal relationships right up to the national scene. If we look at the national scene in terms of our treatment of refugees and asylum seekers, what we see there is the triumph of order over justice. So in other words, there is an issue in terms of refugees. What we do is go into a order mode and have Operation Sovereign Borders. That's all about order. It's about keeping our borders, safe and all that kind of thing. But at the cost of justice. So we're locking innocent people up, and that dynamic exists in local communities as well, in personal relationships. And so the book's an attempt to, explore how those two things, order and justice, dance together to create a safe and just society.
Now, you came to national and international prominence with your message on the sign out the front of your church about LGBTIQA plus and same-sex marriage. But the first time I heard you speak was on an anniversary of 9/11, and you were speaking about the first time that you got some pushback on your sign, which was following 9/11 when you put the words "forgiveness is freedom" on the sign at the front of your church.
Yes.
And I'm interested in exploring that issue of forgiveness, and I suppose within the context of, is order and justice the same as conservatism and progressiveness, and then how do you overlay what is a spiritual concept like forgiveness? Sorry to plunge in the deep end, but
it's okay, yeah, and so often. That dynamic of order and justice is seen in our political life from a conservative and a progressive, so it is really the manifestation often. But what both of those two sides, and then that's the trouble with our political life, we are black and white, we see it as a binary thing, whereas in fact both conservative and progressive have something to offer.
Yes.
And how they dance together is really the important thing. There was Robert Mann, who's a well-known public intellectual, wrote a great article only a few weeks ago on the asylum seeker issue, and saying really until the conservatives and the progressives get out of their corners and come together and try and seek a solution, because at the moment the argument is about beating each other.
Well, at the moment they're stuck to the walls, aren't they?
Not getting these kids off Nauru, and the only way we're going to get these kids off Nauru is for the progressives who are really passionate about justice, and the conservatives who are really concerned, genuinely and rightly concerned about order, come together and try and find a solution.
So to get out of the corners, do they need to forgive themselves and each other?
Well, I think we both have to give up what we see as our moral high ground. And especially the progressives, who tend to want to dwell on them in the moral high ground, and don't want to compromise. But honestly, life together is about compromise, and as a nation, as in our personal relationships as well. In terms of the dynamic of forgiveness, it is as much a political concept as it is a spiritual concept, to be honest. Now, the idea of forgiveness is not saying that, you know, what you did is okay. It may well not be okay. I like to think of it in terms of when someone harms me or hurts me or wounds me in some way, what they've really done is they've fired a metaphorical arrow into my heart or into my being, and that causes a wound. But the trouble is there's a rope on that arrow that is connected to them, and they can wiggle that, and it will continue to cause me pain. The idea of forgiveness is cutting that rope.
You speak in the book about your early years. You were adopted. I do believe that, you know, what happens to us in our formative years as children shapes us in one way or another.
Enormously.
Have you had to apply that very? I mean, the principle of forgiveness is very central to the teachings of Christ, isn't it? How have you found your way down that path?
I mean, I think in one way, shape or form, we all have to forgive our parents for something, and my kids have got to forgive me, no doubt, for all sorts of things as well. So that dynamic, I think I talk in the book in terms of my dad having a problem with alcohol, and that caused a lot of, you know, wounding in our family, and the fact that I, in my younger days, also had a problem with alcohol indicated to me eventually, when I wised up a bit, that I hadn't forgiven him for that, and therefore I was playing out his particular script, and until I could forgive him for that, I would continue to do that. So you know, that was a perfect example of that in my own story. So
you started out as a butcher, which was your adopted dad's trade. Was there a moment when God came to you, or was it more like a progression of you reaching out to or finding the process of becoming...
Damascus Road experience? No, not really. I mean, I went back to church in my early 20s after having 10 years, never been anywhere near a church, and only because it was Christmas Day, and I thought, it's Christmas Day, yeah. You go to church on Christmas Day. It's what I did, and I was captured by the otherness, the transcendence of what was going on in this worship experience, and I think I caught a little glimpse of something that was more than the life I was leading. And so I went back the next week, and the next week, and eventually people started to. I was a young single man, so, you know, obviously people thought, we should grab this bloke and make him a priest, and so I kind of resisted that for a very long time, and I thought, I'll settle this. I'll go to the bishop, and he'll throw me out of his office, and that'll be it. And he didn't. And 30 years later, I'm still wearing this strange uniform.
Now, it's been an interesting decade for the Anglican Church, particularly in this area with the Royal Commission. And I guess this binds those issues of childhood and metaphorical arrows and forgiveness. Are you comfortable with where the Anglican Church currently sits as an outcome of the Royal Commission into institutional child abuse?
I mean, the dynamic we saw in the Royal Commission is another classic example of order and justice. The Church chose order over justice. And it's very easy for the Church to do that. Since the Royal Commission, during that process, we had some wonderful leadership from the then Bishop, Bishop Thompson, who was very clear that he was not going to allow that dynamic to continue, that we would choose justice over order. And so we are now in the Diocese of Newcastle at a point where we are very clear that we will pay proper redress, and not only will we do that, but we will have systems in place that ensure that those kinds of crimes never occur again. Now, of course, when you're dealing with human beings, you can never take your eye off the ball. You can never say, well, you know, we've fixed that now, because constant vigilance is necessary to ensure the safety of vulnerable people. So you asked me, am I comfortable? I'm never totally comfortable, because I think the minute you become totally comfortable, you actually expose vulnerable people to harm. So never complacent, but I am part of an organisation that is utterly committed to justice and to protecting vulnerable people from harm.
How long have you been at Gosford?
I'm in my 19th year in Gosford,
wow,
which is a very long time in one place.
So in terms of the local issues, in terms of justice in your own community, what do you think the major challenges facing this community are right now?
I think the major issues facing our community are in our homes, on our streets, and in our wider community. So the major issue facing us in our homes on the Central Coast is domestic violence. We are one of the highest incidents of domestic violence in the country, and so and that requires an absolute change in culture, especially amongst men. Men have to pick up the ball here, and just simply not accept other men using violence, or even speaking in violent ways, or diminishing women as a joke. And I think, you know, men's got to stand up and say, mate, that's not okay, and change the culture. When we do that, we will see domestic. Secondly, I think the issue on our streets is the homeless issue. We have a high incidence of homelessness on the Central Coast, and that comes from a high incidence of mental illness, mental health issues, and so we've got to do much better in the area of mental health on the Central Coast, and that requires money and lobbying and annoying our politicians until we get the funding that we need. But
are our politicians amenable at a local level? Do you feel like they're listening to what people like you have to say?
It's a difficult issue, and it's not just fixed through money, but and I think all politicians want to see this change. It's such a difficult issue that it's just not a one thing fix all. It's just such a multifaceted thing. So it's not just our pollies, but our whole community has to come together to do something about this.
Now, I must ask you about the impending church closures on the peninsula at Point Clare, and I think at the entrance.
Yes.
And parishioners were told that part of the imperative for closing some of those churches was to pay for compensation to the victims. Do you want to speak to that?
Yes, I mean that is part of the issue, and certainly we as a church, you know, throughout history, and you know, looking back, the Royal Commission looked back about 50 years. So over the last 50 years, have been, you know, every parishioner, you know, every priest, you know, the whole community have been part of a culture that allowed children to be abused. And so we've got to take collective responsibility for this. There's no, I simply won't accept saying I didn't know anything about it. It's not my responsibility. It is. It's our collective responsibility. So therefore, we have to find ways to fund proper redress. But that's only one part of what's happening in terms of the sale of church buildings. Most of our older church buildings on the Central Coast, you would notice, are actually placed on the water, because the priests used to travel by boat.
Oh wow!
And
okay.
yeah, so if you look at, you know, the church here in Gosford, or at the old church at Kincumber, it's at the and so the model of ministry has changed since then. Now we travel by road. But a lot of our churches were built certainly before transport was as easily accessible as it is. And if we want to be a vibrant church well into the 21st and hopefully 22nd and 23rd centuries, then we can't keep running a 19th century model. And at the moment, that's what we're doing. And so we have to run a 20th century model that recognises that people travel for all sorts of things, so we don't need a church on every corner. We also need to be a well-funded church. And so the vision the bishop has for the diocese is to have less parishes, but better funded parishes where we can be better servants to the community.
Okay. Back to other issues that you cover off in the book from a very personal perspective. I think there's everything from your own childhood through to, you know, guns in the streets of America. Are we living, is contemporary society reflective of the kingdom of God or a fallen world?
Hopefully neither of those.
Right.
Well, sadly, on one, the first century Palestinian Jews had this concept of 2 eons of time, the one we live in now and the one that is to come. And the founder of the firm that I work for was utterly obsessed by the one that is to come. And he kept saying the way we bring that into being is to live it now. And so I think all the work we do as a church is about trying to bring that kingdom into existence. And it's not just a religious thing. In fact, it's a very small portion of that is a religious thing. It is a social thing because, as I say in the book, all justice is social. What Jesus called the kingdom of God, I would now call a just society.
Right.
And so bringing a just society into existence requires every human being to live as if it was already a just society. And that's got everything to do with what we do with our money, what we do with our personal power. You know, often we get hooked up on the sex thing. Jesus didn't even mention that, but he spoke so much about what we do with our money and how we manage our finances.
Which brings us to another Royal Commission, doesn't it?
Absolutely, and
Yeah.
the Banking Royal Commission is a clear example of how we have not been living as a just society because financially vulnerable people have been deeply harmed by greed.
So the founder of your brand said, "Love one another." How are we going on a scale of 1 to 10 with that in the world as it is, Father Rod?
It's really difficult to answer that question because I see moments, pockets of incredible events of loving our neighbour.
Absolutely.
And then I see things like the Banking Royal Commission and the Royal Commission into Child Sexual Abuse where the absolute opposite has happened there. So we are a mixture. But you know, I spend a lot of time with Year 12 students now in schools in society and lecturing as a society and culture subject.
Oh, fantastic.
And,
so in public schools?
Public and private. And I always come away utterly inspired by these young people. They are so much more societally aware than I was when I was their age. They are so much more aware of social justice issues and committed to living out a just society. And sometimes I think the sooner my generation get out of the way and let these young people run the show, the better off we'll be.
So you haven't bought your book to do a plug, but it's called Outspoken, available in all good bookshops, and online. And I must ask you, how much do you like writing? In the broad spectrum of what you do for a living and what you give to your family and community, how much do you like writing?
I think most writers would agree that it is a dance between agony and ecstasy when you write. There are moments, mountaintop experiences where a word or a phrase just that comes and you think, I don't know where that came from, but it's wonderful, I'm going to write it down. And then there's the blank page that sits in front of you for days and you just can't get a word down, and that's agony. So it's being a writer is really just putting your humanity on the page, and I think all human beings understand the dance between agony and ecstasy and human living, and
certainly do.
we just have the privilege of putting it down on paper.
And I want to leave on a high point, but just before I do, as a consequence of your outspokenness, you've had services invaded, threats against you. What keeps you going?
Oh, I think what keeps me going is I have 3 and almost 4 grandchildren.
Oh wow!
And my little granddaughter, who's just about to be born, statistically we are told she'll live till she's 104, and so that's well into the 22nd century. I want to leave them a world that is a place in which they can live and love and flourish and be safe, and that's what drives me now.
I think that's a wonderful place to stop. Thank you so much for your time.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.